Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Vachon from Lenovo's data center group. I just wanted to give you a few minutes about myself and let you know what we're going to be talking about today. We're really looking at some ransomware planning that we have discussed internally here at Lenovo, and it's something that we've been kind of forced into over the last couple of years, where the uptick in this environment has really taken hold. Started really in our public sector divisions and areas, and has evolved rapidly into some areas of our corporate concerns and some of our larger customers. And I'm going to go through a couple of those presentations or a couple of those examples for you today. This is something that we have taken on as part of our global um, product offering scheme. So we've enrolled it into the Lenovo way of doing our traditional planning and architecture. It's not something that we really thought about doing even 3 or 4 years ago, but it's something that we've had to do based on the response from our customers. And so let me get right into it and start down the process here. Over the next 40 minutes, I'd really like to take you into some of the history around ransomware, where we saw it kind of develop from. You might be a little bit surprised by some of that. Give you a little bit more background on what we kind of look at from ransomware, the current attacks that we're seeing, and those are again a bit surprising. We've had some announcements from authorities here in the United States, and we've got some examples from around the world that were new kind of influences and directions from the attackers. The anatomy of it, or the ransomware impacts, those are something that our customers are feeling every day, and there are things that we generally want to avoid as we're getting attacked. We need to make sure that we're mitigating those impacts. The anatomy of an attack, pardon me, is kind of important to understand as well. And so we've actually laid out the steps that we see attacks happen in, so that you can better understand where you need to address your resources to. And then layers of protection. This is something that we're developing as we've kind of gone along through here over the last 2 years, more specifically. This is an area that we think is a big development for the prevention against these attacks. And then last but not least, the Lenovo protection ecosystem. Show you what we think that you should be trying to do inside your own environments to protect against um, these types of attacks, and do the best you can to mitigate them, and then recover from them if you do get hit and have to recover from one of those environments, okay, or one of those attacks. So let's start right off by talking a little bit more about history of the attacks. So this was a little bit surprising to me when I actually was digging into it. It turns out that ransomware was really developed by a guy called Dr. J.L. Pop back in 1989. His intent was actually to create this to get more um, notoriety from his fellow biologists in the World Health Organization around an AIDS conference. He distributed 20,000 floppy disks out to the environment, and then proceeded to encrypt their data and ask for $189 to fix their repairs or their computers quickly. It was a kind of an ill-advised way of gaining notoriety, but that's how it all began. Was back in 2000 or back in 1989. I can't say that I actually remember this happening, but evidently it was a fairly large uh, flop in getting him some notoriety that he maybe didn't want. And after that, it kind of disappeared for a while, or remained in the outskirts of the environments until the until the internet really took hold, and that's when major ransomware um, developers came up with what was known at the time as um, the Citadel of Invention. And this went out, and it was partly distributed over email. It was out through different types of uh, environments, and then it was also distributed via the web, visiting malicious websites. It ran rapid for quite a while, but was ultimately able to be easily defeated by some fixes and some patching on your hardware. This was not something that kept going. In 2014, we saw a crypto wall. We saw the development of crypto locker, which was the biggest impact that I remember coming in 2015. Those were really the next generation. And what we saw here was the advent of having to pay for the decryption and really soliciting money from an e-commerce website, Bitcoin, and payment due based on that type of payment rather than traditional monetary amounts being sent via check or check or credit card or whatever it was. Crypto wall really came in to its own right over that period of time. Now, these attacks were mostly focused on individuals and were kind of blast out attacks for phishing attacks, and they actually raked in millions of dollars over that period of time. But it also developed what was next called ransomware as a service. This is where we started to see the development of crime organizations that built out not only the software, they would give it to a would-be attacker with little or no experience in IT and be able to sell it to them and provide them as a service based on an attack point. And if you had a list of emails or a list of people that you wanted to attack, they would take that on for you and even provide you with full technical support in a call center. So this is really when ransomware went from kind of the outskirts to full-fledged crime organization, one of the most severe threats that we've seen hit our industry over the last 10 to 15 years. And in doing this, we saw an uptick in hits in the public sector first. And then now we're seeing them more again as we get into our commercial segments, and large companies are now experiencing these criminals coming after them. And really, what we should do is kind of define what we're calling ransomware. Right? Ransomware is a malicious software which restricts access to the computer or the files that you have in your disposal until somebody pays it, and it spreads via cryptovira. It doesn't necessarily happen immediately. It can happen over a period of time. It can be infected on your computer for quite a long time, and we'll talk about that further as we get into this presentation. But it's something that can happen, 6, 8 months later. It encrypts and holds for ransom the sensitive data and really prevents you from getting in and getting after or getting to your data and prevents you from accessing that. The criminals that are involved in this phenomenal pace they're growing it at just leaps and bounds, and that's because they're getting paid. They're making money on it, and these criminal groups are getting more funds than most enterprises because, frankly, their overhead is fairly low, and it's the problem of paying them and giving them more funds to work with has really grown the industry beyond what we even thought. 2019 report showed in excess of $1.5 trillion being paid out. I have some other statistics here on the next slide that were really kind of shocking. Again, as I was doing my research to this environment, data breaches continue to be costlier as a result of consumer records being lost and stolen year after year. 3.86 million is the average breach cost to a large organization. We see an attack every 14 seconds. And that has increased over the last year. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when we talk about the examples that we're seeing. The total cost to businesses is somewhere near $7.5 trillion. I'm sorry, $7.5 billion. And it's expected to increase by 2021. And I just actually saw an update to this. We have it at $6 trillion. It's actually growing day by day. their estimate is going up because the increased number of attacks that we're seeing and the number of individuals that are actually being hit by these viruses. So the losses are due to unexpected downtime are right around $8,500 an hour. That's a tremendous amount of cost to be incurred by a company, and that does not include what they're paying to these criminals. And the growth rate of ransomware, as I mentioned earlier, is just exploded. So the growth rate is 104% over the past year, and I actually think that that's a little bit light. And the reason for that being on the light side is because we do not hear about all the attacks that happen. We're only catching a very small number of them, I think, in the press and that are actually being reported. Some are being reported out, and now requirements are in place to report them. But I think that a lot more are happening than are actually being reported. And that's something we'll talk about as we go through this. The average ransomware for unlocking a single computer is $300 to $500, but our large corporations are paying millions of dollars to have their data unlocked. So even though the average is still somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 500, the cost per person or the cost per attack is obviously much, much greater than that. And that's part of the reason that they're successful at getting paid. They know exactly how much the data is worth. They know how much we're willing um, to pay to get it back, and they're charging that amount to unencrypt the data. Recent examples. This is I'm going to go through 4 or 5 of these because there's several of these that are unique for very specific reasons. And the one I picked here at the beginning here is the Brazilian court lockdown, the attack that happened there. This was significant because it was a public entity that had hundreds of federal court cases that were being locked up for multiple days. It went on for a little over 2 weeks, and the thing that was kind of interesting here was that there was 2 items. One was that it affected the federal court cases, and every one of them became subject to questioning whether the data that was housed in the federal court system was still valid. They had to go through and validate that all of the court records were as they should have been. Second, it was suggested during this attack that the hackers actually breached the virtual divide. That is, they went from a physical device to a virtual machine and encrypted that virtual machine and or deleted it. There was not so much there was no clarification on this, obviously, from the federal court system in Brazil, but that was reported by one of the consultants that was called in later on to fix some of the environments. But this is the first time that we've actually seen this where we've been able to break over that divide, and a hacker's been able to get in there and actually encrypt something or delete something or get into the virtual system environment and get across that divide that kind of separates the two. And it represents a pretty significant change in the way that we think about our hypervisors and the virtual machines that are in there. We now have to take those virtual machines with the same kind of protections that we would have taken the machines that were outside of that environment, right? Dundee College is the next one, and this one was kind of brutal, especially on the college itself. The hackers actually went in and sat inside of the environment long enough to discover exactly how much money the college had to spend, and they requested that exact amount back from the college in order to decrypt their environment. The college's environment was such that the encryption literally wiped them digitally off the map. Nothing existed after the encryption happened. And so there was really a decision to be made by the college to whether to pay and get the decryption done or to rebuild from scratch. And what they decided to do was rebuild because they could not afford ultimately to pay the ransom that the attackers had requested. They went back and actually rebuilt it, and during that time, they actually utilized some cloud functionality to rebuild into. So this became one of those environments where the attackers actually stayed in there long enough to get a good feel for what their attack could provide to them. So it was a little bit vicious, and frankly, it was something of an eye opener. The last one here on kind of the bad side of the equation. We're going to get some good news actually out of some of this. Um, the first rule, I love this headline by the registers where I grab most of this information from, and first rule of Ransom Club is don't pay the ransom. That's absolutely a message that I hope that this conversation or this presentation hits home on. Most 50% at least of the people that pay the ransom don't ultimately get the decryption code out of this out of their attackers. So Garmin, Backbod, Carlson Wagonlit, all of them paid. It sounds like Carlson Wagonlit paid somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 million. Now, could they afford it? Sure, to get their data back, and it seems like they did. 400 bitcoins, approximately $450 million, or I'm sorry, $4.5 million. Uh, it's an incredible amount of money to be paying just to get your data that you own back, and there's no guarantees that you're going to get your data back or that they're not going to hit you again. Um, to me, that's the biggest statement, is that you really cannot count on criminals to honor their word. I know it's surprising, but it is a fact of the world. Criminals are criminals for a reason. They like to prey on people. They have no qualms about lying to you. So Carlson Wagonlit, Garmin, all of these were hit sometime in the beginning of the summer, and all of them seem to have gone through a similar type of environment where they had to react quickly to an attack, and they had to come up with some sort of payment in order to get their systems restored back. Now, the good news here is an example from Tesla that recently happened within the last month. A Tesla employee was approached to become an insider in one of these attacks. And by the way, it has been speculated that Carlson Wagonlit and Garmin were actually inside jobs as well. It's in some of the press releases that I found that they're tracking and trying to figure out whether it was an inside job or not. But this particular employee at Tesla's mega or giga plant out in I believe it's in Nevada, was approached by a friend, and they offered him a substantial amount of money to be an insider in there, and he decided not to take it. So that really bodes well for Tesla. In this particular case, they actually caught the guy. The FBI was notified, and they caught him trying to board a plane to get out of the country, and they're prosecuting him. So there is some hope out there that people are now taking this a lot more seriously and understanding the ramifications. And employees need to be not only educated on it, but to be told what to do if they are approached or if this comes up in their environment. Because if there's no education around what to do, most people will just ignore it and let it slide by. If it's taken seriously, that's our best hope for actually mitigating some of these attacks. The last thing is the FBI warning that recently hit the press, and that FBI warning was pretty straightforward. The U.S. healthcare system has a credible threat against it, and in the midst of a pandemic, the last thing we need is our healthcare system taking another hit from some would-be attackers. It just shows the level of depravity that these people will go to. In the middle of this pandemic, there's no thoughts whatsoever for the greater good. It's all about gaining money. And so This warning obviously is one of grave concern and something that should be taken seriously. Um, so let's look at the impacts of one of these attacks, and we'll just quickly run through some of the potentials. The loss of critical business data is obvious. Most of these are obvious. Um, the loss of that data is probably one of the most intrinsic values that you have as a company, and so the loss of that definitely prevents you from doing additional work and prevents you from providing the work product that you've been ultimately trying to get out the door. The ever-present and growing threat, especially within the public sector. We mentioned this earlier, or I mentioned it earlier. The public sector has been hit particularly hard in my experience. It seemed like a summer ago, every school district, every municipality I was working with was having some sort of threat levied against it. Uh, Even some universities that I was working with at the time were experiencing some pretty bad um, spikes in attacks, phishing attacks. One university was had been hit by a ransom attack and was actually delaying its start of school by a couple weeks at a time until they could go back and rebuild their environment. That type of disruption to your normal work environment is is extremely detrimental and something that most customers have a difficult time withstanding. In their particular case, the ransomware was time bombed. As I've mentioned before, it can sit in your environment for quite some time, and they were having a difficult time restoring. They had good backups, but they were having a difficult time restoring back to the point before the ransomware would hit again. And they had to go back quite a few months before they got a working copy of their data that didn't have the ransomware built into it. So we'll talk about that in just a minute and how we can help you plan for that. So the loss of trust and reputation amongst customers and partners. This is one that I think is also a very costly part of it. You spend years building that trust with your customers and partners that you're going to guard their data, you're going to guard their intellectual property, and that can be wiped out in a matter of minutes with one single attack. The lack of trust between companies, between customer and company, is something that is incredibly difficult to rebuild and takes a long time to do that. So these are all the impacts that we've seen hit our customers. Significant cost is on top of ransom payments. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning during that block page where I talked about $8,500 an hour. On top of whatever ransom you paid, you're still going to have to go through some remediation, even if you pay the ransom. So, not only getting the data back, but then protecting against a rehit, protecting against and making sure that the data you got back is valid and you've got all of it. It takes a significant amount of IT resources and time. Okay, let's look at how a company gets kind of attacked, or what are the the I'm having a hard time with that word today. Autonomy of the attack really looks. How do companies get hit by it? Many cases, it starts with the end users, right? Either they're being socially engineered, as we were kind of referring to with Tesla and some of the others, where you have an insider that's bringing it into the environment. You have a phishing email that somebody selects on and inadvertently installs a virus into the system, or a website where you've gone in and picked on something that you shouldn't have. Um, as it relates to the phishing attack, we'd like to blame inexperience and training of users on this, but even some hardened IT professionals, i.e., myself, uh, I was attacked by or got caught in a phishing scam. Shortly after joining Lenovo, I got an email from our CEO, or who I thought was our CEO, that was really well formulated, and it was easily looked at by some of the other IT professionals that I surveyed, They looked at it and thought that this was a very well formed email. It had our CEO's name in, and that was not an easy thing to spell out and get correct. And they also used as part of the messaging a short name that we use for him, YY. And it was in the email and it was signed YY at the bottom. And so it looked very legitimate. The message was it was a private communication that was confidential that I needed to install a PDF reader for. And of course, I installed that PDF reader because I'm anxious to read that message from our CEO. And then, sure enough, it was a phishing email that installed a virus that attacked my Workday account. This was a very painful experience for me. I had only been on the job a couple weeks, and so it really kind of set me in the wrong direction right off the bat with some of my peers. But it was a lesson well learned for not only myself, but a lot of us inside of the corporation that it can happen to even some people that should know better, and myself included in that. Once your desktop is infected, it really can go the full gamut of the environment that it's in. We've seen it hit not only the local files, right, that are embedded on your disk drives, but it can also go to the shared filed locations that your system has access to, or that your user account has access to. If you've got mounted directories, if you've got file shares, those can get encrypted as well. If you're part of a team that has access to a share, all of those files can be encrypted, whether you own them or not. If you have access to them, they can get encrypted. We've even seen recently a white hat hacker show and demonstrate how that same kind of pervasiveness can go into the 365 environment. It can go to Outlook and Teams and OneDrive and can encrypt those. Now, to be honest, we have not seen an environment that's actually had that experience, and it hasn't been reported back, but it has been demonstrated as something that can happen, and that there is ways for the attackers to actually get in and start to encrypt files that are in the environment. And if you have 365, you know that you've got a 30-day backup window built into that. But the data that's actually up in 365 is your responsibility. Providing you access to it is Microsoft's responsibility. So there's a shared responsibility model there that you need to be very aware of. And encrypted data is still your data. Whether it's locked or not is not really Microsoft's environment. That's really your environment to go out and protect and to ensure. So they're giving you access to that data. If that data is encrypted inside of Outlook, that's really up to you to prevent against. So there's some shared responsibility there that needs to be carefully evaluated in your environment and make sure that you're addressing it appropriately. Now, if we take this model here and we look at it in a slightly different form, this is really well, I kind of borrowed some stuff from the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain diagram. Their diagram uses 8 phases. This one's 6, but I want to give them credit for it because they kind of walk through the same steps of a ransomware attack in some of the work that I read up on their site. And it really starts out with a malicious email received and/or website, and then the actions taken by the end user. If you look along the bottom here, primary triggers for the first 3 steps are human error, and that's plain and simple. That's one of the things that we're trying to help and prevent against, and I'm going to get back to that in just a minute. Part of that human error needs to be corrected by the corporations in training and evaluation, and I'm going to expand upon that in just a little bit. But that is an area that is primary to prevention. And if you look along the bottom here, the line goes from prevention, detection, and remediation. The, the middle section of this graph really it starts to go from human error into system management, right? We're looking at privilege escalation. We're looking at lateral movement within the systems. Those are all system IT professional responsibilities. We need to look at how much privilege we're giving each individual user and preventing them from going beyond what they really need from a scope. how many times we've looked through our environment and we see administrative assistants that have literally access to every system in the environment. Do they really need to have that level of privilege going across the environment? Yes, they support some very important people in our environment, but should they also have a role that allows them to have access, carte blanche across the entire environment? So looking at those people and looking at what they need to access on a daily basis should be part of the foundation that we're building on, and part of our remediation and part of our detection. Okay, so as we start to boil this down, we get to the end of this and we're looking at a foundational backup capability. So the idea of taking our data, taking our environment, and making sure that we have a validated, tested backup process in place. And we know on a regular basis that we're testing that to make sure that we have the ability to roll back 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, 24 hours, and good incremental intervals so that we have the ability to quickly recover without data loss or the minimal data loss. And then we have immutable copies that are baked on top of that, that are either air gapped or off-site, and make sure that we have the ability to really protect against something that we haven't foreseen in the remediation process. And so we're going to talk through some of that in just a minute here with some expansion on this topic. So as we kind of boil those 6 steps down, these are the 3 protection areas that we're really focused on. So end user protection. So that endpoint protection is particularly important from the standpoint that we need to ensure that we're sizing that appropriately for the device that we're putting it on. If we overload that device and we cause it to slow down, the users are going to find a way to work around it. So the onus is on IT, and it's on the environment to make sure that the protection that we're putting on that device is appropriate for that particular user and appropriate for that device to be utilizing. If you're overloading that device, they're going to find a way around it. And the primary failure in end user protection is that it's been turned off. I know from my own experience, I get frustrated. I go through the process of updating my firmware on a regular basis. I go through the process of turning on my malware, my antivirus. But as I get into workloads that demand more of my machine, I overload that environment. The first trigger that I know that I can turn off and gain some performance back is that ransomware or that antivirus software. And so with that knowledge, it comes responsibility. And so we have to make sure that we're designing systems appropriately. We're providing them with enough memory. We're providing them with enough processor so that they can adequately protect the system that we're asking them to protect and still get the job done at a reasonable amount of time. System protection is also an area that we as IT haven't done enough for. We can look at doing performance monitoring on a regular basis that identifies spikes where they shouldn't be using AI applications. And by the way, back in the end user protection, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but AI has become an important part of endpoint protection. But AI in system protection is even more important. And so monitoring that performance for users that are spiking, for encryption that starts to happen that shouldn't have happened, and monitoring those environments for anything that's outside of the normal, including increased networking traffic, file transfers that shouldn't be going on from data spot to data spot or haven't happened in the past, should be at least flagged for concern. And then in the end, making sure that we protect our data with backup and strong encryption on those environments. Encryption is a definite way that we can avoid some of the environment problems that we are currently experiencing. If you encrypt your data prior to somebody else coming in, they can't re-encrypt it. It's already encrypted. So you protect your environment by employing SED drives or doing software encryption on your data stores, on your shared environments. yes, this will cause some performance impacts, but you need to go through and evaluate those and make sure that you're applying those capabilities appropriately throughout the environment. If we look at 4 layers, and I increased from the previous slide of 3 to 4, I added this top one because I think that the end user malware training is one of the most important ones that's overlooked. Uh, any new people that come into your environment, any people that have been in your environment need to go through a training process. They need to be on a regular schedule. And I was talking to a customer yesterday, and he took it even a step further. He not only is employing training and prevention and testing of those individuals, so sending them example emails, sending them tests along the way so that they know what to look for. Uh, they're actually taking a score from that testing and from the internal training and applying it to their profile as part of their employment records, and they're ranking those users based on risk. If that user fails the test repeatedly, has been um, has not done the right things when they get procedures implemented, we find that they've turned off their antivirus software more than a certain amount of time. They get bad scores, and those scores get put into their yearly record and into their evaluation. And I thought about it, and from an employee standpoint, I really don't like that idea. But from an IT perspective and prevention and protection perspective, I really think that that's an excellent idea that should be adopted maybe more broadly across the IT environments. So end user training and end user testing is something that I added to this. End user device protection installed and using on all end clients, required software updates, required firmware updates to make sure that we're keeping our systems up to the most active level possible. Data center protection, multi-factor authentications across all systems, system performance monitoring on servers and storage, AI programs to augment these systems, data encryption across the enterprise storage, and then foundational backup. The 3-2-1 backup policy, and as mentioned, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And then immutable copies of the backup. Um, Air gapping. It used to be tape drive was the way that everybody did an air gap. Um, that kind of went away. But over the last year, I've sold more tape drives into customers than I ever thought I ever would again. Simply because it is a simple way to create that immutable copy and air gapped outside of the environment that really nothing can touch. It is an old school way of doing things, but it is certainly one of the ways. Another way is using cloud volumes and backing up to a cloud environment that does not have direct connection back to your environment, and therefore air gapping away from your AD, air gapping away from all of the other things in your environment. So 3-2-1, I just mentioned. So that's 3 copies of your data in a good backup strategy. 2 different media, so 2 different locations. One of them offsite. This is a recommendation that came from our partner Veeam over in our software and backup environment, and I truly believe that this is a very good way of creating your backup policies and making sure that you're fully protected and you have copies of the data. Now, the 3 copies of the data, one of them can be your production copy. You do want 2 other copies, and one of them to be off-site or out of the reach of your immediate environment. This builds a very strong backup environment. It builds a great foundation for you to build off of and make sure that you have an RTO that is appropriate for your business model. And it's totally within the capabilities of almost all IT environments to do this, even on a simple scale. And as I mentioned, even if you have to go old school and go back to it as something like a tape library, right? Quickly, since we are closing in on the end of our time here, Lenovo protection ecosystem starts with our core competency. Our core competency is in the hardware that sits in your data center. Our Think system servers, storage are some of the highest resilient systems on the market today. We make a full product line of servers, storage, and some networking components. We also offer complete systems where we will build you out a Think Agile system that is racked and stacked and ready for deployment. It can be converged, it can be hyper-converged, software-defined, appliances in a rack. We cover the gamut really from the very smallest single server and single storage array all the way up to data center size environments. In some of the largest HPC customers in the world rely on Lenovo Think Systems, Think Agile products. If we go back to that chart that I was showing just a moment ago, and we look at what we would put in and recommend at these different layers. So from the endpoint protection to the system protection to proactive data encryption, some of the products that we would recommend are on the endpoints. And by the way, Lenovo also builds fantastic laptops, desktops. We have a product called ThinkShield. ThinkShield actually incorporates in firmware updates as well as software updates, and we can embed upon that SentinelOne, which uses AI to protect against malware, protect against ransomware attacks and phishing attacks. We move up the scale into system protection. We have our Think Management Integrated Manager, or Think Systems Integrated Manager called TIMS, and we combine that with CryptoSpike. CryptoSpike is brought to us via ProLion. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a second. But this sits on top of our storage arrays, our DM storage arrays, and it monitors that storage array for performance and other types of anomalies. And it has an AI engine built into it as well that recognizes patterns and knows when a user is accessing 1,000 files in the matter of a couple seconds, that's out of the norm and probably should be flagged, and can stop that user in its tracks until it's had time to review, until an administrator has time to review the request and can turn that user back on. So there is mitigation built into these environments. It's a lightweight deployment. It works not just on the endpoint, but also on the enterprise side. It's not something that a user can disable, and it is something that helps prevent against these types of attacks and can help us by doing 3 points of communication across there. Veeam is our partner, along with our ONTAP software on the storage arrays. We have snapshots that can quickly be set up to be 5-minute intervals, 15-minute intervals, excuse me. And we can have those stored locally. We can incorporate them into the Veeam backup system and transport them off to a separate site. We can transfer them off to the cloud. We can even do old school, as mentioned, back to a tape library. These are all features that can be adapted as part of a Lenovo environment or a part of a data center environment quickly and fairly easily. One of the things that I'm adding here is the know before. This is kind of an unsolicited proposal for you on training and simulated phishing attacks. Know before. I've not worked extensively with them, but I've seen some of the work that they have done. The customer that I was referring to earlier in this discussion uses them extensively across their environment and vouches that this is one of the best awareness trainings that they were able to come up with, and it is absolutely one of the things that should be rolled into your protection scheme. It's something that really should be involved in your entire environment. The rest of these I've mentioned as part of that previous slide. SentinelOne, AI-powered endpoint and security, Think System Information Management, and ProLion, which is our partner with storage monitoring and mediation. It's really what I wanted to cover today. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.